Thanks for tuning in to Minds of Tomorrow. I'm your host, Luis Acevedo, and with me today I have Bronwyn Williams. She is a futurist and an economist. So Bronwyn, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. So you touch on a lot of very interesting topics, but today I want to try to focus on what you have on your website, which is called the New Theory of Relativity. And so if you can go into a little bit as to what the new theory of relativity is exactly.
Yeah, so this was like a keynote or a bit of a thesis that I put together around about 2018. So it's a few years back now, but I think a lot of the points that were addressed there have materialized, which is always quite nice and validating for someone like myself, whose job it is to follow trends and to sort of not necessarily predict the future, but kind of predict what's likely to happen. And what that piece really does look at is the general sort of subjectivity that the world has fallen into, and looks at it from lots of different angles. Because when we can't find common ground or total truth, firstly, we get a lot of conflict, but also there becomes a lot of gray room with which we can be manipulated. Because if we don't know what is right and what is wrong and what a line is that should not be crossed, we are essentially sort of helpless at the whims of the world and what's going on around us. So it's a call to action to kind of look to try and see that what we can actually find, where the bedrock is, how far we have to go down, and what we need to unpick and unravel to get to some sort of actual truth and consensus.
Gotcha. So could you go into, like, I guess, what do you mean by truth and consensus? Because when we talk about relativity, a lot of people are just assuming that, the truth in that context is subjective. So is there any objective truth in this? And so if we could just dive down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, we go right through to the philosophy of it, right? This is the core debate on pretty much any academic field. Is there objective truth or is it all relative? Which is why the title is a bit of a pun on old Einstein and everyone else. And philosophers debate this, so do physicists, which is where it gets really, really interesting because, physics likes to kind of tell us that the observer changes the actual reality. But at the same time, a lot of that discourse can, I think from my perspective, certainly from the research that I've looked at and the way that I sort of interpret a lot of the philosophy and science that goes on across the world, is that quite often those tend to be debates around semantics, which is very, very dangerous for us because we are sort of, as Terry Pratchett says, storytelling apes, right? So stories matter, and the words that we use and the way we frame things do change our reality. And that is an objective truth, basically, that the way we perceive the world and what we expect to happen does influence what is going to happen next. So when you start to think of things in a slightly more sort of abstracted way, not a subjective way, but just sort of taking a bit of a step back, you can start to see that there are some fundamental truths. And if we're not prepared to believe that there is something there underneath all those piles of turtles, then we should just totally give up and become all nihilists. But from a sort of futures thinking perspective, which is basically my position in the world, I think that's a kind of untenable position. So I've chosen to live my life as though there might be truth that is out there, even though we might not be able to get to it ourselves. And I'd rather be wrong about that than to be wrong about the converse, which I think is a much more dangerous and a much more depressing way to live. So that's a bit of a disclaimer. And I have many smart friends who thoroughly disagree with me there, who believe that nihilism basically is the way of the world and we should just accept it. But I'm not quite prepared to accept that. I'd rather do a bit more research and a bit more work and figure out what it is, what the possible bedrock can be. Because without that, without having any sort of tether in space or in time upon which to build our lives and build our societies, we have to give up the possibility of any sort of progress. And even, as I said, even if it's not possible, even if progress is a pipe dream, we have to kind of believe that it isn't. We need to have some sort of degree of pragmatic optimism in order to move forward. We have to have optimism, and that means we have to believe in something just to open our eyes and get out of bed in the morning. Again, that might not be the sort of conversation your poor listeners want to have right now, but that's a bit of a sort of background as to my general approach to life, the universe, and everything.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting to go down this little rabbit hole here, and I'm sure some of them will enjoy it. I've spoken with a philosopher. His name is Stefan Sorgen. I'm not sure if you've heard of him. He's big into, nihilism, and posthumanism and metahumanism is actually the philosophy in which he's engaging in. And when we were talking about nihilism, we were actually talking about the beauty of it. And I'm not saying I'm a nihilist. I do believe that there is objective truth. I follow a lot of the Christian worldview is where, a lot of my perspective comes from. But I like to entertain these other thoughts as well. And one of the beauties I see in nihilism is, from my opinion, the illusion that one can build their own reality, right? Because if there is no objective reality, well, then you can choose what you want your reality to be. And so I find that intriguing, but to me, I don't feel that it'll actually allow for a society to be built. I think you need some objective truth in order to anchor your people, your community. You need to have something that connects them. And I feel that nihilism doesn't really have that. And I think that we're actually seeing the problems of nihilism arise in our world today, at least in the Western world. And I know South Africa, as you mentioned before, I think we went live, that it has a lot of Western traits to it, right? Because it was a colony at one point. So, I think that we're seeing a lot of the negative sides of nihilism come to fruition at the moment. And I know that we can criticize, as I just said, my perspective being from Christianity, what Christianity has done to the world too in a negative way. But I guess to try and shift the conversation here in regards to truth, do you feel that as we're entering in this new digital age, that what is real or what is true, that line's going to be blurred even more? And what I mean by the digital age is like the metaverse, this parallel universe essentially that's coming about, and it's going to create this new reality. So is truth going to be harder to come by? And if so, will social cohesion be harder to, have?
I think it's a great way to start the conversation, right? So we don't know if there is objective truth out there, like you were saying. I choose to live my life as though there is, because that gives me something to anchor myself to. But this sort of idea extends to our much more natural societal world, as you were saying, that even if there is no objective truth, even if I'm completely wrong and you're wrong about Christianity and God and whatever else, that's kind of beside the point, because in order to build a society, in order to build a civilization, a nation, and to do anything, even just an organization or a company, we have to agree on at least common truth. There's no way to build a society without some sort of base agreement on what common truth is, even if that common truth might be found to be objectively wanting, either in the future or even at the present moment. We have to sort of agree, at least agree in the lie, right? In order to do anything. Now, hopefully we agree around an actual truth rather than agree around a lie, but we have to find that consensus, even if you want to use sort of consensus in inverted commas, in order to move forward into any sort of progress, or to do any sort of project, or to find any semblance of harmony, even just the basics of determining whether or not we should be killing each other if they're getting in each other's way, for example. We have to agree on this common consensus, or this common truth, which we have decided in most of our sort of weird Western sort of democracies, if you want to call it that, to be some sort of sense of rule of law rather than rule by law. So we've kind of agreed on that as being a truth. If you look at the American Constitution too, the sort of founding fathers talking about, we hold these truths to be self-evident. This is the sort of truth that I'm talking about. Maybe you want to debate about some of those points. Maybe you don't even agree that those are truths, but we have to agree as the group that there are some self-evident, or at least commonly agreed truths in order to do anything or move anywhere. And we've kind of seen an unraveling of this. And I think you have mentioned the church, I think, is part of this unraveling. It's due to like a larger picture of the unraveling of all meaning, this detaching of meaning from human life. And don't worry, I'll get to virtual reality in a second. But I think it's worth sort of putting this also in context if we start big before we go small, that meaning has been stripped out of our lives, any sort of objective sense of meaning or sense of truth. And here I'm talking about meaning, when you really look at it from a philosophical point of view, or just from a very human point of view. Even a child will tell you this. Most meaning is attached to some sort of immortality. So whether that immortality is a faith in a truth that is a God, or something supernatural that extends your life beyond the natural plane, or that immortality is really what nature's immortality is, which is immortality through biology, through reproduction, through having children, or it's immortality by leaving something substantial behind. And then, of course, there's the new fourth sort of pipe dream version of that, and that is the sort of immortality of achieving actual immortality. In other words, actually trying to live forever by extending your biological life or uploading your brain to a computer, which is all very speculative. But we see people pursuing these things as the other three routes to immortality are sort of disappearing. So it's quite obvious that as the world moves away from formal structured religion, you lose that sort of meaning. And unfortunately, that sort of meaning in an afterlife doesn't translate as neatly to other forms of spirituality that don't promise that immortality. That meaning gets stripped away. The other ways that we've seen now with the sort of the press and the propaganda around having children is bad or selfish. You shouldn't be procreating because, you know, it's bad for the planet. There should be less of you, that your seed or your biology needs to make way for someone else's space, right? That it's selfish to want that biological immortality. It's causing quite a lot of people to choose not to have children. Other people are not having children because they're scared of existential crises. In other words, they're scared once again of this end to life and to their future generations. And the third route is also being unraveled. And that is that increasingly, as so much of our worth, and as you say, you know, like your worth is where your heart is, where your treasure lies, where your worth is, where your life's work resides. As that life's work and that value that you create in the world is becoming more digitized and more virtualized. In other words, so many of us don't provide real goods and services. Instead, we work in the knowledge economy, which means our life's work lives on sort of digital documents that will expire along with the laptop we used and the programming language that our text was typed in, right? We no longer leave behind things like journals or published books. So few of us get to do that, right? Even the buildings that we live in, you used to be able to sort of leave a farm down to your family, right? Now everything gets sort of subdivided, made smaller, and this sort of white picket fence dream is kind of being replaced by, like, you know, timeshare in a pod, right? Again, there's this lack of continuity in our lives. And the shift into the virtual realm is just part of that. It's part of this sort of untethering us in space and time, like I like to say. We're kind of having our past snipped off us by technology, as things like deepfake technology and just the advent of digital anything means that nothing is cast in stone anymore. Literally, it's written in bits and bytes can be changed, right? We can put literal words into historical figures' mouths. And because, as I said, we are these storytelling animals, if the stories we are told are lies, we believe those lies. In fact, you could be told a different lie to me. So again, our common truth becomes fragmented, perhaps into many, many, many different directions. With like smart AI combined with things like the sort of so-called deepfake technologies, we can all listen to the same live broadcasts. Like I'm going to listen to one later tonight by my government when they'll tell us what the latest round of lockdown regulations will be. The technology already exists, that live stream could be customized to me, to you, to every other one of the sort of 58 million people in our country in order to get the best results out of us, to buy into that message, which should be a pretty terrifying thought if we are going to hope to build any sort of common consensus. And it gets more and more so like that as we sort of try and virtualize more and more of our lives. On the one hand, we're getting cut off from the past and from the future by digitizing what used to be discrete. And as we digitize it, we do two things. Firstly, we flatten the discrete. So anything digitized is literally flattened. The picture that I'm seeing you on is less nuanced than you would be in real life. I can't pick up quite the same number of cues, right? My voice has been flattened into only the sort of sounds that my computer can process and your computer can output on the other side, right? So everything gets sort of flattened, which means that the edges get taken off, the subtlety gets taken off, and we're left with a distorted view of reality that still feels kind of real, but you also in that sort of uncanny valley where things are sort of real, but not quite. And we're not quite sure how to sort of deal with that, right? So everything is becoming totally disconnected from space, from time, and from each other. Digital also puts distance between people. It's another layer, another filter between our ability to connect with actual human beings. And that's how we build relationships, because we are obviously pack animals. We are apes at the end of the day, all of us, whether we like to be termed that or not. We are primates, and primates are pack animals. And we build relationships in order to do anything, in order to find any of those streams of meaning that I spoke about do involve interpersonal relations. And interpersonal relations that have been processed and flattened rather than being discrete and continuous are a very different sorts of relationship, and not cohesive, or not leading towards strong relationships and the founding of those shared values and shared meanings that are so important for us to actually bond. And this sort of brings me to the idea of the sort of the new kind of panopticon society that we are building. The technology is enhancing a lot of these trends that I've spoken about. And in the panopticon, which I'm sure many of you would have heard about, it's a sort of power theory that says that you have a kind of tower in the middle of a circular room. And the idea is that the authority can see everyone around the room, but all the individual people can't see each other properly, right? So it's this very weird society where everyone is naked, entirely exposed, like everything on display, but at the same time, you're alone, right? So it's this idea of we see each other all the time, but we never actually get to connect. And because we can't connect, we can't share stories. And if we can't share stories and find common truth, we're going to end up believing the truth of the authority that has decided to place itself within this the society in which trust and common truth has been entirely broken. Is a society that's very vulnerable to authoritarian control. So I've spoken a lot. You're welcome to pick up on anything I've said or bring me back into the conversation you want to have.
Yeah, no, I thought you touched on a lot of really good points, and I like the way that you can tie in a lot of points, together. I really do appreciate that. And one of the big overlapping things that I noticed there was essentially this rewriting of the social contract that we have right now. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that, as you mentioned, we are sort of ending history as we know it with the fact that people aren't getting passed down farms the way they used to. You don't have generational history. Like for instance, my family, I don't know much about my great grandparents, but I'm sure you go back 3 generations and my great great grandparents would know about their grandparents and their great grandparents, etc. As you see a lot with older generations, they seem to be more in tune with their families. But I think I fall in that line between Gen Z and millennial, being born in '95. So some places will tell me I'm Gen Z, some will tell you I'm millennial. It doesn't matter. I'm right on the border. And so I feel a lot of people, especially in those two generations, struggle with knowing where they actually come from. And then they find their identity through the society. And as you were saying, they're going to be looking to the authority to get their direction, and they're not going to know what is real and what isn't real. And I think that line is going to be even harder to distinguish as we become more digital, because we're building this tremendous digital economy and culture, which I'm all for. I think it's actually going to do a lot of good for humanity, which I think we should touch on that a little bit. Is what are going to be, in your opinions, some of the benefits of this new economy and world that's being built on the internet, and how will it relate to the social do you think there's a fear of authority just disseminating all the rules as opposed to being a referee? But do you think that this digitalization that's taking place will help mitigate that at all?
I'm quite ambivalent in terms of whether technology is good or bad. I think it is a tool. It accelerates everything else that's going on around us, right? I mean, if you've got a shovel, you can make a bigger hole, but what sort of hole you're digging can be a grave, or can be a place to plant a tree. I mean, that's sort of entirely up to us. I don't think that much has changed when it comes to the technologies we have and how powerful they are. When it comes to digital technology, I did already speak about how digitalization of really anything does flatten reality. So it's not reality. We can talk about virtual reality, and virtual reality is entirely based on real reality. There's nothing in virtual reality that wasn't inspired by a flesh and blood human being in the real world, or inspired by nature at large, right? We can take it, we can interpret it, and then we flatten it into as many pixels as we can pack into our screen, right? So virtual reality is always going to be a substitute for real reality, and it's never going to be a perfect substitute. It's going to be more of a map and less of the actual territory. And I think we're in a lot of danger if we start to see the virtual space as being the territory rather than being a map. A slice, a segment of what real reality is. And it can be a very exciting segment. I mean, I'm sure you've heard about Mark Andreessen and his reality privilege that's going on at the moment, right? Where he's saying, real world, the real reality is so shit for the vast majority of actual human beings. Who are we as the reality privileged? In other words, the people that actually enjoy real life, that have a nice house, and have someone that loves us, and have enough food to eat. Who are we to deny the impoverished masses the opportunity to have a fake, flattened version of our lovely, privileged reality, right? I mean, if you can slap a VR headset on a starving kid and make him think that he's full, isn't that better than the kid thinking that he is hungry? At least that's the sort of essence of the topic as I see it, which from a certain angle, viewed in a certain direction, again, everything is subjective these days. It's like, oh, how can you disagree with that, right? If we can alleviate suffering at all, we should pursue that. But the big subtext is that basically you're telling all these people they can eat VR cake, right? It's very, very last days of Versailles when you look at it from a different direction. And who are the reality privileged? And I would probably count myself within that class to deny people real reality privilege. Who are we to say that a substitute is better than the real deal? So there is quite a big conversation to be had there about how, you know, the virtual reality can perhaps paper over a few gunshot wounds, but it's never going to actually replace the real life experience of the very wealthy or the very privileged in the real world. It's much like kind of Jeff Bezos saying, you know, like, we're going to have to choose who's lucky enough to stay on Earth, and everyone else can sort of go live on a space shuttle, right? And hope their bones don't atrophy too much. Because the real reality is that the wealthiest, most privileged people in the world realize it's actually quite nice here on Earth, right? They realize that there's a richness to real life that cannot be experienced online. So I use that as a bit of disclaimer. I think the same issues are playing out in the world of the more sort of financial side of the digital economy. And of course, I know you're quite keen on crypto and all of those good things. And crypto is fantastic. I definitely do skew more libertarian than authoritarian on the good old Nolan cross. So I'm all for technology that does distribute rather than concentrate power. But I do have some quite big questions as to whether that's actually going to happen, because tools can end up being used in ways that we don't necessarily think they are. I think there's another issue there that sort of maps onto that reality privileged question when it comes to like cryptonomics and the crypto economy itself, and that we do have to understand that everything that takes place on a blockchain is an abstraction on reality. Now, I'm not sure how familiar you are with like Economics 101, but one of the first things they'll teach you in any economics class is that there are two economies. There's the real economy and there's the financial economy. And what's the difference? The financial economy is a claim on the real economy, right? So the financial economy is the share. The real economy is the actual business. The financial economy is the bond. The real economy is the house that you get to live in. So in other words, you can inflate the money supply as much as you like. And I'm sure you all know about that in the US with your like 40% of all the dollars in existence being sort of printed within 12 months. You know, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that you've increased claims on reality, but you have not increased reality by one atom. There's still the same amount of stuff. Now crypto comes along. And the way I'm sort of explaining it to people that aren't sort of familiar with this, and I've been orbiting the world of crypto since around about 2009. So I'm like, I understand the whole sort of like what's happened. Well, I wouldn't say I'm like in the circle. I'm definitely close enough to be a court jester in both courts, I would probably say. And the thing with crypto is that crypto can almost be seen as sort of like reality cubed when it comes to the financial economy. So crypto is almost like a claim on the financial economy that's a claim on the real economy. And it's very good at increasing the velocity of wealth and money. It's very good at moving those claims around and getting very new, very big winners in spaces where those winners would have never had a seat at the table in sort of layer 2 of the sort of financial economy, which is dominated by big banks and big government. So in some ways it's better there, but we do have to remember that that only really matters money is neutral in the long run. Crypto is also neutral in the long run. It changes the claims, it doesn't change reality. And until we can kind of see how those claims translate back into real returns for real people, like who actually eats at the end of the day, right? Who actually sleeps? How does that affect my physical body and my physical rights? That's the sort of question that I always like to challenge people playing in the crypto space to really, really think about. It's great if you're making money. I have no problem with that. I'm fully on board. Like, if you can be the capitalist that you want to be, you go out there and make the money you want to make. But do think carefully about the fact that you are playing in an abstracted economy that's still dependent on the real economy. Now, layer two, as we want to sort of call it that, the financialized economy, has learned that lesson over the last couple of years. With what's going on now, you're starting to see the seeds of inflation, which, most of us have been like, it's about time. Sometimes someone's got to pay for all this free money and all this sort of gerrymandering of the world's wealth. And you're also starting to see things like problems with supply chain crunches, that no matter how much money you pump into the system doesn't fix the supply chain if the ship is literally stuck in the Suez Canal. Real rarely matters. Money just moves who gets to use reality around. So I think that's my first sort of general view on the world of crypto. Very good at velocity, very good at making money change hands. The question is it is kind of still a bit of a pass the parcel game. You want to make sure that you cash out of that casino before the chips are called in. Right. And that brings us back to, you mentioned a bit earlier that I speak quite a lot about the whole social contract thing, and this is part of it. Crypto fits into that social contract conversation in quite destructive ways. But again, if you're destroying things that are bad, destruction can actually be a net good. And our social contracts in the weird sort of democratic world are under stress because we've overpromised and underdelivered. We were speaking a bit before we started the show about how really what happened, the first sort of wave of democratic sort of social contracts were that the people got to rule, that's what democracy is, and the government was there to pretty much serve the people, to enforce the rules, and the rules were kind of agreed upon based on sort of self-evident truths, right? So you had these sort of basic rules, and the government's job was to sort of defend those rules and make sure that people played by those rules. In other words, government's job was sort of to defend people, but it sort of shifted over time that government's roles become more to sort of support people or to actually provide for people. And the big shift that happened there was after the big world wars of last century, where you had those very big world wars. And after that, we started to build things like social security and pension funds. And most sort of interestingly for me anyway, you also started to build national health insurance systems. National health insurance systems are really interesting because they're only one generation old, right? I mean, like, you've still got people that were alive before those things were put in place in Europe. So we don't know yet if they're affordable or not. And national health insurance is very subjective, right? I mean, like, in terms of economic terms, healthcare is infinitely elastic, right? For myself or for my child, I'm prepared to pay absolutely anything to save our lives, right? Whereas, for someone else, I mean, not quite so much, but anyway, healthcare for me and for mine is infinitely elastic. So it becomes an infinite claim on the state. And the state, of course, is still kind of limited by the terms and conditions of the original social contract, which was you and I, we give up some social or some physical freedoms. And in exchange, we get some physical and some physical sort of, security, right? So we pay some taxes and we might get some benefits, and we agree to submit to some laws. In exchange, we get some law and order. And that's all kind of falling apart right now because we're running out of money to pay the one side of the equation, right? So claims on healthcare are increasing, claims on welfare are increasing at the same time that real wealth that's being diluted through all those things like money printing and just through sort of general inequality and all the rest of it is kind of going down. So in other words, we're paying more into our social contract and we're kind of getting less out. Now, this, of course, puts our rather large governments in quite a lot of trouble at the moment, but they've also kind of realized quite recently that if you kind of look at that social contract from a slightly different direction, they actually realize that they have more power on the table than perhaps they had been using in the past. And this is because of things like healthcare being infinitely elastic. If the state or the collective is paying for those things, they also have a right to determine your risk level, right? So this is, again, where it comes back to that subjectivity and that breakdown of relativity and objectivity around how that social contract is written. We start to see that we are shifting from sort of social contracts defined around harm and breaking very finite objective rules towards social contracts that are defined more and more around risk. And risk, of course, can be interpreted into sort of a blank check for any sort of law and order that you might like, right? So things that risk-based laws, or as I like to kind of call them, sort of skeleton key laws, take away that objectivity of rule of law and replace it by more arbitrary rule by law. So things that would fit into that would be things like laws around health and safety and what's happened with COVID and the pandemic and everything, because you sort of become a criminal or social pariah, not by harming someone, but by perhaps rather putting someone else into danger. And that, of course, can be extended in many, many, many directions. But it can also extend into the increase in speech laws and censorship laws that we're seeing at the moment, because when harm is defined not as physical harm, but rather sort of a mental or emotional harm, that harm can be quite subjective. Harm is in the eye of the recipient of the harm, right? And that means that we do see very strange laws popping up across Europe at the moment, where sort of hate speech is defined by how someone interpreted what you said, rather than by what you said itself. So instead of having a law that says these words or these phrases or these terms for people are banned, we rather have a law that says, if you have been offended by what someone says, that person is guilty. So in other words, we're not judging the law objectively anymore, we're judging it subjectively. So it's very, very interesting. I think it all kind of ties together in this thesis of the fact that we no longer have common truth, and we're going to have to figure out a new social contract that's built on sand rather than on a bedrock of any sort of self-evident truths. So all those examples that I mentioned, you don't have to agree with them or take a side on them. They're merely there to illustrate the fact that our society is shifting into much more subjective space. And subjective space is a conflict-based space, because there's no fine line that says this is right and this is wrong, right? You have to constantly negotiate that, which can be quite exhausting.
Yeah, so you just said something there that I thought was really interesting, because it's the opposite of what you usually hear. And you said the common truth should be built on sand, not a bedrock. And obviously it's because the point you're trying to make here is, we're constantly changing. We're going through a lot of,
Probably it should be that they are. Like, we don't have any bedrock to build anything on. That I don't want that. I'm not saying that's what we should have.
I guess I was
that's all we've got. We've only got sand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Thank you for clarifying that, because I thought that was what you believed for a second. So, okay.
No.
All right.
So I would like us to find common truths. That's
right.
My general thing. I think we kind of have to find some common ground, or we are just building a future on shifting sand. But that's all we've got. That's the point. When objectivity is being pulled out, when you're not basing a society based on self-evident truths or on a particular constitution, all of our constitutions are up for negotiation at the moment, if you haven't noticed. We're not hanging out society together based on a particular religious faith, which is why religious faith-based societies do tend to stick around, right? Again, you don't have to like them or not, but they do tend to stick around because the community has that common sort of self-evident truths that they believe in. The other alternative is just complete sort of rule by code or rule by machine, which we can see in other parts of the world, which takes away the common consensus altogether. And as I kind of said, replaces it with that panopticon authority that just says, because you cannot agree on anything, we're just going to tell this one entity will just tell everyone what to do. So it is a bit of a sort of Faustian bargain, right? You have to kind of choose, are you willing to negotiate that space, or are you going to give up that agency and rather defer to just say, take that from us and just govern us?
Yeah, and I think
which is the end of democracy, which is really extraordinary, right?
Now, do you think that there's going to be some new form of governance that comes along with this new social contract that we have? And as you touched on, this code, being ruled like code is law. You said that you were in cryptocurrency very early on, like almost at the it was the inception of Bitcoin. I think it came out in 2009.
I was about a year-ish late, yeah.
Yeah, and that's been like a big theme in the community is, code by, the law of code. And so, um, yeah, if you could go into that a little bit, like this new governance, like what is your take on that? Like you just said that it's the end of democracy, but is there going to be something new that replaces it? Like, when we talk about transhumanism, right, we're talking about merging with machines, which completely changes the dynamic of our society in large, not just from life extension, but in so many other ways. So I guess if you could just touch on, your opinions of if there's going to
What
be
is likely and what could be interesting, I suppose I could answer it that way. I mean, like, we have to understand that democracy, much like having a middle class, is the experiment. It's definitely not the norm in human history. Most of human history, the strong have ruled the weak, right? And it's been quite unequal, the way power has been distributed. So if you want a likely case scenario, like we generally try to do in futures foresight, the likely case scenario is that if our democratic sort of experiment, our democratic social welfare sort of state experiment falls apart, well, the likely alternative is for us to revert to some sort of degree of state or some sort of Leviathan, right? Some sort of power, some sort of strong ruling over the weak. And of course, we can see this sort of what's going on in the East for a very sort of classic example of what's going there. And I think that what we need to be aware of is that technology allows authoritarians to actually authoritarian in ways that they were not able to do even sort of 20, 30 years ago. We now have the ability to install a 24/7 completely impenetrable sort of Wi-Fi curtain. We can have an outdoor open air panopticon prison if we want to. And for a lot of people, I think that's the most simple solution, right? Like we can't manage ourselves, we can't manage our money, we can't share our toys. Like just govern us, rule by the code will tell us what to do, and we will give up our sort of free will and agency as human beings. That's quite an attractive proposition. I know that it's usually portrayed as being a dystopian position. I wouldn't say I would particularly love it myself, but it's actually quite an attractive position if you sit down and listen to people and what they actually want. Most people just want a simple life. They want not to be harmed. They want enough to eat. They want a comfortable place to stay. They want to know their family is safe. And you know what? The panopticon society can actually deliver that. So I think that if you do lean more towards or have a bit of a libertarian bent and care about things like free will and like consciousness and those sorts of things, you need to be very aware of what you're actually dealing with is actually quite attractive to vast swaths of the population. All those not reality privileged people that I spoke about earlier are probably quite amenable to a more sort of objectively code distributed world ahead that replaces the vagaries of human society with a much more control, law and order based society. So that's probably the likely scenario for quite a large portions of the world going forward, particularly when you start layering like things like the COVID crisis and the climate crisis on board. In times of crisis and panic, people do look to defer to authority. And if human authority is not cutting it, we'd be quite happy to substitute that for a more objective sort of, rule by code. Now, the other side is also becoming more and more code related, and that would be like the technologies of crypto. Old Peter Thiel spoke about that sort of dichotomy like years ago, right? Didn't he say like AI was communist and crypto is libertarian? I'm not sure it's quite as simple as that, because either of those technologies could be used by either sorts of human governments. Again, technology, even if it is ruling you in the political sphere, is still just an abstraction of reality, and the real world is what really matters. But I would say on that other side, that other sort of likely future that we see ahead, I think you alluded to it a bit more, like if we lose common consensus, and if there are those among us who don't want to fall into an artificial common consensus, there are quite a lot of movements at the moment towards sort of breaking away from that and just sort of setting up, as I'm calling them, some sort of forms of citadels within the virtual space and in the real space once again. This would be everything from sort of micronations and from startup cities to successions and rumors of successions. Even on a larger scale, things like Brexit fall into this, right? It's sort of like opting out of the sort of mainstream consensus and forming some sort of like, it's actually quite Randian, right? So forming these little enclaves of like so-called liberty. but it comes with a catch. I mean, you got to go back to old John Locke and co, right? You got the Leviathan or you got state of nature. And it's quite a stark contrast at the moment. And that's really the likely futures that we're looking at. Sort of decentralized technology does allow you to form that sort of very state of nature enclave. But let's make no mistake that in the state of nature world, it's still a world of the strong versus the weak, right? Only in those spots, it's more the strong is more defined by financial clout than it is by physical clout. Whereas on perhaps the more Leviathan side of the world, that clout is very much backed up by military force, whichever of the big sort of global superpowers you're looking at there. So it's going to be interesting to see how this falls apart. But for me, the most likely scenario for sort of politics and sort of, the next phase of the social contract is likely to be some sort of version of South Africa, where I am right now, where increasingly more and more people are dependent upon a state who they look to for security and guidance, and that increasingly that security and guidance will be administered and facilitated by some sort of technological controls, because it's more efficient. Technology is very efficient at doing that. But within those sort of seas of compliance and control, you're going to find enclaves of basically anarchy. And again, anarchy is quite a big word, but we've seen the breakdown of law and order. In my country, you had insurrections. We tend to be a bit further ahead, the unraveling of the social contract from my perspective. But now we see it in your country, United States, San Francisco, we've shifted from sort of like calling daylight robbery thefts to calling it sort of like direct welfare, right? You can just walk into a store, take what you like and leave, right? So yeah. That's anarchy, all right? So what's going to happen is you'll see that people that do have the means and the technological know-how and understand how to play the crypto game, who have taken advantage of the great reshuffling of money in the sort of the third layer of the virtualized economy, that will take their gains and apply them in the real world. And that's the phase that I'm excited to see. I want to see what happens when the money that's been made and transferred from the weak-minded to the strong-minded in the virtual economy, how are they actually going to use that in the real world? And if they don't, you're going to end up part of the panopticon.
Yeah,
that's a lot. I gave a lot of. I probably sounded very vague, but
no. I'm following you completely, and I think a really good historical time frame to look at for what we're experiencing right now, I think, is the Chinese period in time, where it was called the Warring State period, or if you're familiar with that, where basically the big country that China was fragmented with a bunch of little kingdoms. And then eventually over time, I forgot, I think it was like the Qin dynasty that finally took over all of China after the Warring State period. But for years, like hundreds of years, if I'm not mistaken, you had these little kingdoms that were trying to accumulate a bunch of power over time and, eventually become what China is today. So I think what you're describing is that's happening on a mass scale, where we're going to see.
Yeah, it's happening at a global scale. That panopticon that I speak of is becoming more and more global, right? I mean, we've seen this with the global coordinated response to COVID, right? I mean, everyone from third world to first world to countries to, like geopolitical enemies, everyone's adopted the same untested strategy, and we're all doing it, right? So we're all using the same technologies, the same tools, and as time goes on, those tools are becoming more ubiquitous and more in your face, and they're being used for more and more sort of reasons. And this takes place at a global level because COVID is a global challenge. So you get this more global panopticon, means you got a more local response to that sort of hiding and finding your sort of your citadel to sort of opt out of whatever is going on out there, whatever that might be. So that's quite interesting to see. And of course, with climate change coming up now, I've read policy papers that have from think tanks that have suggested that we turn like track and trace systems into sort of carbon rationing passports, which might sound completely nuts, but I mean, that people are having these conversations, and you have like Mariana Mazzucato, one of the world's most pronounced economists, talking about things like climate lockdowns. That's going to be enforced, right? Just like you have to enforce the lockdown with some sort of track and trace, you're going to have to enforce the climate lockdown, right? So, and this is going to have to be done at a global level because climate's again a global challenge. So we're going to see more and more of these sort of global coordinated responses to risks to health again, right? Like it used to be our international agencies dealt with actual harm, right? Now it's like you're trying to be proactive by responding to reduce risk. But that's a blank check to basically sort of coordinate on any sort of policy level. So we're going to see the the Leviathan like really live up to its name on the one hand, but on the other hand, we've got quite a lot of quite well-off cowboys who are going to go their own way. So I think a lot of my sort of favorite futurist friends, like Dr. Ian Pearson, Time Guide on Twitter, if you want to find him, he has spoken about us being in a new dark age for many reasons. There are many parallels with that period of time also on the Western calendar, just like you're talking about sort of the warring states in China. Most civilizations go through these periods where the Leviathan wins and the periods where sort of anarchy takes over. And we kind of on a sort of clashing of the worldviews there. I think I've mentioned this quite a lot of times too, that we have the technology to be gods or monsters, right? We have the technology to enforce actual, total, automated totalism, which we never had before. We've also got the technology to live almost entirely off-grid on every dynamic. Again, I live in a sort of semi, not quite failed state, but could happen to go that way sort of country where we have rolling blackouts. They call them load shedding. Everything's sort of gentrified, right? You know, the nice terms. We have the odd water outage. You know, we've had provinces that have reached day zero in their taps and all the rest of it. So, you know, like we understand service delivery breakdown. We have a rampant disorder in the law space, right? Our police are known to be quite corrupt. Most of us have private security companies. We have our own solar panels. We have our own JoJo tanks to hold the water. That's what we call them. Private schools are cheaper than public schools in many, many places. So a lot of that is already sort of taken place. So it sounds quite dramatic when you sort of think about this sort of future with these sort of seas of total control and this like these citadels of anarchy in between them. But, you know, if you want to come and see what it actually looks like in the modern world, because we have actually progressed since the Middle Ages. We have running water, we have the internet. The future's never going to be quite as bad or good as you think it is. But we do. I live with an armed guard at my gate, right? I live in a mini citadel. I'm already living this way.
It sounds like South Africa is living in the future, because I've been telling, you know, my family that this is where I kind of foresee America heading. And it's going to really depend on what state you're in, because America is very diverse in the state. Like just going through the states, just like not even talking about immigration or multiculturalism or anything like that, but just in the nation itself, there's a lot of diversity among states. Like you go to in Ohio, where I live, it's vastly different than when you go to, say, Idaho. Like the culture there is way different. The people there are way different. And so, you know, you're going to have different ways this, you know, comes out, you know, like you're describing here with these citadels. I like that word, by the way. You hear that a lot, you know, in the crypto Twitter. Everybody talks about the citadels that they're trying to build with their currency or their NFTs or whatever.
You have to build them on the ground too, or it means nothing,
exactly.
Right? You have to bring that abstraction back. You have to realize all your NFTs, all your crypto holdings are just a claim on the real world. And you can keep your money in the casino as long as you can. Right. But you have to understand it only matters when you take it out, right?
Exactly. And actually where I wanted to touch on this is like, although it may seem like these are dark days ahead, if I'm not mistaken, if I have my history right, what happened after the Dark Ages was the Renaissance, if I'm not mistaken.
History ebbs and flows. So like the history of humanity is generally up and to the rise. There's no guarantee that we will continue in that direction, but we only can base our assumptions on the future based on past performance. I know past performance is not a good indicator of exactly where we're heading, but it's all we've got. And if we look at history as a whole, in general, we have managed to progress up until this point. It's up to us, it's up to our generation, people listening to this call, to determine whether that general trajectory carries on up or not. But in between, it's been an awfully wiggly curve, right? We've had some pretty steep downturns, and unfortunately, we've got a lot of reckonings that have to take place right now. We've eaten too many lunches, and we have left too many unpaid bills at the cosmic table, quite frankly, right? I mean, like at some point there is a reckoning. At some point, you know, sort of intergenerational sort of atrocities come home and bite you. As anyone that lives in any sort of society understands, your skeletons do come back to haunt you. You have to resolve the issues of your past, and you can't money print your way into prosperity. You can just money print your way into more claims. You can money print your way into conflict. You can money print your way into redistribution, but you can't money print your way into growth, right? You have to have people actually working. And that'd probably be my challenge to people that are in the crypto and the third abstracted cubed economy right now, to really think about that. to think about how, as long as you're playing and staying in that space, you're kind of sitting it out, right? You're almost betting against the human project. And that might be fine for you. I think we were speaking about this earlier, that it's almost unfair to ask people to sort of cast their dies to benefit people that will be born after they have finished here on this earth. But if we can kind of reclaim some of those avenues to immortality that I was speaking about, like actually leaving meaningful footprints in the actual earth, building structures that last, writing content that's not just about how to shill the next coin, but it's actually about how to live a good life. The sort of books that people still read, like there's very few books that were written in pre-biblical times that we kind of still read. Don't you want to leave something like that behind, or to actually commit to having a family and having children, or to actually pursuing more sort of technological immortality, whatever that might be? Think about that. Think about how you can participate rather than just hedge against that upward curve and trajectory of humanity, because that sort of capital can make a huge difference as to whether the coming downturn, which I don't think is avoidable, we can probably push it out by I'd reckon about maximum 10 years, but I don't think much more than that. So I'm talking about sort of real global, more chickens coming home to roost, and we'll have to do something with those chickens one way or another. But after that, how long that downturn it could be very short.
Yeah. Well, this is why I've also been talking a lot about DAOs lately, decentralized autonomous organizations. I feel that they are going to give rise to, I guess, the new elites. I mean, yeah, you can have your own like crypto and become very wealthy as an individual, but what we really need is organization in order to have true power, right?
Organizations that are doing actual things. Yes.
Exactly. And so I think
that are governing real people in real places, right? That are not just governing chips on the table.
Yes, exactly.
That will make the difference. Yes.
Yes, 100%. 100%. And so that's why I've been really big on talking about the fact that although we want to talk about in crypto, hey, you're decoupling politics from finance, which I don't buy that argument, by the way. I don't really think that you're
everything's politics. Also, like everything's power.
Exactly. Right. Like that's one thing that I really disagree on in the community as a whole, because what I think will happen for those who are smart enough to see this, as opposed to just playing in the casino, as you call, I think you rightfully call it, this is a casino, but there are some things that do strike gold, right? So that will be here to stay. And if you get really good at that, you can make a lot of money from it and, build up a really strong, fortress of wealth, if you will. But as you've been, really touching on, that if you don't have it grounded in reality, it does you no good. Like
it does you no good. It does nobody any good. I mean, like I like the casino analogy, because you can choose to play the slot machines or you can play at the poker table. Like you can actually use your brain, right? It's not to say it's all luck. Like there's some skill involved, but we have to understand, if we do want to survive the anarchy or the Leviathan, you have to really understand that your self-sovereign identity and that all your abstracted wealth in the world is not going to get your physical ass on a plane out of your country if it's not attached to your biological passport, right? Right? There's other power layers at play. So the only way to make your self-sovereign identity work for you in this sort of a future is to actually invest it in real power, right? Mm-hmm. Right. How do you change the guy at the border gate, right? How do you change who controls him? That's a much more interesting conversation than whether your identity can be anonymized or not when you are buying tokens. Quite frankly, it doesn't matter if that identity is not valid to get you a heart transplant when your physical body needs it. We have to start thinking in those terms. And that's the next sort of phase. But there are signs that people are thinking about this, like DAOs are investing in biological research. That's really interesting, right? So instead of investing in a sort of tech startup, you're investing in like that's just designed to extract value even more so from the sort of financial economy, which almost all the Silicon Valley big tech companies are platform companies, which are wealth accelerators rather than sort of, wealth multipliers. There's a slight difference over there, right? So, a lot of technology projects, a lot of crypto projects too, sort of have exponential growth in wealth accumulation for the owner of the project, but they only provide kind of linear growth in value to the overall economy. And the beauty of capitalism, when it works, is that any trade is mutually beneficial in terms of utility swap between party A and party B. It's not sort of perpetually sort of skewed or stacked against one party and towards the other. And if you want to change these sort of cycles, you have to make sure that you're engaging in win-win trades, right? You know, we got to be sharing that marginal utility. Otherwise, nobody does want to play with libertarians, right? Like you have to kind of be.
Yeah, no, and
so
this is
share your toys. But there's a difference between sharing your toys willingly and like having your toys confiscated and reallocated, right? But that's something we got to look at ourselves as people that don't like full-on panopticon authoritarianism. We have to understand that, you know, some of the reasons why people do is because they see it's the only way that they can get us to kind of play with them. So we all got to look at ourselves.
Yeah, and this is exactly why I'm extremely bullish on, you know, agriculture. Like I think that a lot of people should, my family, we try to do what we can to be self-sufficient. You know, we've grown food in our home. We've learned how to do, you know, the garden inside of an apartment and things like that. And, you know, we want to have a homestead eventually. And I think that these things are going to be very huge going into the future. Okay. And yeah, so I'm really bullish on people becoming more self-sufficient and using their financial gains very wisely and putting it back into the real world, as you've been touching on very well. So I really appreciate you coming on the show. I really do. You've shared a lot of things that I actually wasn't expecting the conversation to go in this direction and stay on crypto so much, but I feel that you shared a lot of valuable insights that a lot of people can, you know, really use, as opposed to just speaking in abstractions. You know, you actually, I think, you know, touched on some real tangible things people can do. So if people are interested in staying up to date in your work, following what you have to say, where can they find you?
Yeah, on Twitter, I'm at Bronwyn Williams, and I've just started as the Chief Commercial Officer with a company called Carbon-Based Lifeforms. We're busy building a crypto/virtual reality game, which kind of probably flies in the face of most of what we've spoken about. But you know, you have to be part of the conversation in order to change it, right? So you're welcome to follow us along there as we play around trying to merge the real economy with the virtual economy in a way that multiplies rather than sort of aggregates wealth and value going forward.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. I've had a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you very much.
All right. You have a good one.
Thank you.